She wasn't supposed to be there. At least, that's what they thought the moment she walked in. A 17-year-old black girl in a wrinkled school uniform and scuffed-up sneakers, stepping through the glass doors of the most exclusive luxury car dealership in the city. The kind of place where customers wore $1,000 watches and cologne that cost more than a month's rent. She didn't belong, not according to their rules. But Alexis Carter wasn't just anyone. And this wasn't just a casual visit. She moved slowly, almost reverently, through the sleek, marble-floored showroom, her eyes wide with curiosity, but her posture calm and self-assured. Her fingers lightly traced the curve of a polished chrome side mirror as she passed a matte black Ferrari, then paused in front of a silver Bentley with doors like wings. None of the cars intimidated her. She looked at them the way an artist looks at a blank canvas. She didn't glance at the staff, but they were all watching her. Every single one. From the receptionist who lowered her voice mid-call to the sales associates standing beside high-end customers, pretending to be deep in conversation while clearly side-eyeing her. The judgment was palpable, heavy, and Alexis felt every ounce of it. But her steps didn't falter. She made her way toward the centerpiece of the showroom, a fire-red Lamborghini Aventador SVJ Roadster, parked beneath a gleaming spotlight like a crown jewel. Her eyes lit up, not in a flashy, wide-eyed way, but with a kind of quiet intensity. She stood in front of it, arms folded, just staring, imagining something only she could see. Maybe it was the expression on her dad's face when he received it. Maybe it was her own reflection in its mirror finish paint, proof of how far she'd come in life already. Whatever it was, it made her smile, just a little, the corners of her mouth curling upward in silent satisfaction. Then came the interruption. Blake Thompson, mid-40s, polished to perfection in a navy blue suit and expensive leather shoes that clicked like punctuation marks against the marble floor. He walked over with a practiced smile, the kind you wear when you're trying to be polite to someone you think is wasting your time. "Good afternoon," he said, hands clasped behind his back. "Are you looking for someone?" Alexis turned to him, unfazed, and replied, "No. I'm interested in this Lamborghini." That's when the look changed. His smile tightened, his eyebrows raised just slightly. He glanced over at one of his colleagues across the room, shared a quick smirk, and said with a hint of amusement, "This particular model starts at around $600,000. It's not exactly a beginner's car." She knew what he meant, and so did everyone within earshot. The air got heavier, tighter. One of the employees nearby coughed into his hand, trying to cover a laugh. Alexis stood tall, her voice steady. "I understand. I'd still like to know more about it." But Blake's eyes were already dismissive. He wasn't seeing her anymore, not as a customer, not even as a person. Just an inconvenience. A teenager in sneakers who dared to stand in front of a car he couldn't afford himself. "There are more accessible models you might want to consider," he said smoothly, gesturing vaguely toward the far end of the showroom where used sedans and SUVs sat quietly in the shadows. "Perhaps something more realistic." Alexis's jaw clenched just slightly, not out of embarrassment, but out of recognition. She'd seen that look before, heard that tone. It wasn't about the car. It never was. It was about her skin, her age, her shoes. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice. She just gave him one long, final look, then turned and walked out of the dealership. No scene, no shouting, but with every step she made it clear. This wasn't over. The next morning, the showroom was bustling again, full of energy and small talk, luxury deals and espresso. Blake Thompson was in his usual spot by the main desk, laughing with a regular client about vacation homes and golf memberships. The staff were all back to their standard routines, polishing fenders, checking tablets, running credit scores behind the scenes. Business as usual, until it wasn't. At precisely 9:42 a.m., the low rumble of an engine pierced through the ambient noise. Not just any engine, a V12 so smooth and powerful it made the glass tremble ever so slightly. Heads turned, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Through the massive glass windows they saw it, a black Rolls-Royce Phantom slowly gliding into the valet circle like royalty entering its court. The sunlight hit its deep obsidian paint in waves, reflections dancing like liquid metal. It didn't just arrive, it announced itself. Blake set down his espresso mid-sip, already heading toward the door, adjusting his tie. He didn't know who was inside, but anyone arriving in that car was VIP by default. The dealership owner, Richard Mason, appeared too, practically beaming as he followed Blake outside. Together they watched the back door of the Rolls-Royce open with a soft mechanical sigh, and out stepped a man whose presence was so commanding the atmosphere shifted in an instant. Marcus Carter, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his posture straight, his gaze sharp, and his movements slow and deliberate, like someone fully aware of his power and in no rush to prove it. He looked directly at Blake, who extended his hand with a bright, professional smile. "Welcome to Boston Luxury Motors," Blake began. "It's an honor to have you with us." Marcus didn't shake his hand, not right away. Instead, he spoke calmly, with a voice so controlled it drew every ear in the area toward him. "I was here yesterday, just not in person, but someone very important to me was, and unfortunately she didn't receive the welcome she deserved." The temperature dropped. Blake blinked, his smile faltering. "I'm sorry, sir. May I ask who you're referring to?" Marcus stepped forward. "My daughter, Alexis Carter. She came here yesterday, alone, wearing a school uniform. You didn't treat her like a customer. You treated her like a joke." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "That was your first mistake." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was suffocating. Every staff member within earshot froze. Blake's lips parted, but nothing came out. Marcus Carter was not a man to be trifled with. A billionaire tech founder, philanthropist, visionary, and in this moment, father, the kind who wasn't there to shop. He was there to teach a lesson, one that no one in that showroom would ever forget. Blake felt his stomach turn as Marcus Carter's words sank in. The realization was instant, brutal, and irreversible. The girl he had brushed off without a second thought, the one he had spoken down to, laughed at behind her back, treated as if she didn't deserve to be in the same room as a luxury car, was the daughter of a man powerful enough to buy every vehicle in the showroom 10 times over without blinking. And more importantly, she was the daughter of a man who didn't tolerate disrespect, not toward his family, and certainly not toward his child. Blake forced a shallow breath and tried to find his footing. "Mr. Carter, if I had known she was your daughter, I can assure you—" But Marcus didn't even flinch. He raised a hand, the gesture small but firm, and Blake went silent instantly. "That's exactly the problem," Marcus said. His voice wasn't angry, it was calm, too calm. The kind of calm that comes right before a storm. If she wasn't my daughter, if she was just any other girl, any other black girl, wearing a school uniform, walking into your store with quiet confidence, you still would have treated her the same. That's the issue. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. Every word hit like a hammer. You saw her skin, you saw her clothes, you made a decision, not based on character, not on intent, but on appearance. The room had gone so quiet you could have heard the breath catch in every employee's chest. Richard Mason, the dealership's owner, who had once stood beside Blake with an air of superiority and salesmanship, now seemed smaller, visibly uncomfortable, shrinking beside the man who had turned the entire atmosphere inside out with just a few sentences. Blake opened his mouth again, this time more cautiously. "Mr. Carter, please believe me, it was never personal. Our team follows certain procedures to—" Marcus took a slow step forward, his gaze so direct it made Blake lower his eyes. "Don't insult me," he said. "You think I built billion-dollar systems without understanding how people work? I know prejudice when I see it, and your procedures are nothing more than an excuse wrapped in a suit and tie." He looked around the room. "Tell me, How many customers who walked in yesterday dressed in a suit and tie were asked if they could afford the cars here? How many were redirected to the more affordable section of your showroom? His voice remained level, but the weight behind his words made the marble floor feel like it was shifting beneath everyone's feet. Let me make something perfectly clear. What happened yesterday wasn't just bad service. It was systemic disrespect, a culture problem, a values problem. Blake was frozen, his throat tight, heart pounding. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a reckoning, and Marcus wasn't here for apologies. He was here for justice, for change, and he was just getting started. Marcus turned to Richard Mason next, leveling him with the same gaze. Mr. Mason, I came here today not to shop. I'm not here to negotiate or haggle over specs or prices. I have no interest in your sales pitch. I came to see how your team operates, to see what kind of leadership is being exercised under your roof, and I must say, what I witnessed speaks volumes. Richard tried to interject, but Marcus shook his head. Don't. You had your chance to speak yesterday, when a young girl stood in this very room and asked about a car with genuine interest and intent. Instead, you stood by while your staff laughed, mocked, and dismissed her. What you failed to realize is that she wasn't just a customer, she was a test, one you failed spectacularly. Another long pause followed, stretching across the entire showroom like an invisible cord ready to snap. Then Marcus continued, his voice lowering, becoming almost personal. Alexis didn't come here looking to prove anything to anyone. She came because she wanted to buy a car for someone she loves, a gift, not because she had to, because she wanted to show appreciation, gratitude, something that can't be bought with money. She stood here, quietly, respectfully, and you made her feel small. You stripped her of dignity you had no right to take. He turned again to Blake, and this time the tension in the air thickened. Do you remember what you said to her before she left? About how she should look for a Toyota or a Honda? Blake's face flushed with shame. He stammered, but Marcus cut him off with one swift sentence. Let me ask you this. What do you drive, Mr. Thompson? Blake blinked, caught off guard. I have a BMW M5. Nice car, Marcus replied. But it's interesting, isn't it? You felt entitled to mock a girl for aspiring beyond what you yourself drive. That one landed. Hard. A few employees shifted uncomfortably in the background. Blake said nothing. Finally, Marcus stepped back, took a deep breath, and looked around the room one last time. I believe in second chances, but not without accountability. You made her feel invisible, so now I'm going to make sure you're seen for exactly what you are. And if this dealership wants to have any future relationship with me, or with any other client who values integrity, you'll need to start proving that you understand what respect means, not in words, in actions. And with that, Marcus Carter walked away, not defeated, not enraged, but in full control. Because sometimes the most powerful statements don't come from shouting. They come from standing tall, speaking truth, and walking out of the room knowing the message has been delivered. The silence he left behind wasn't empty. It was filled with everything they never expected to hear, and everything they needed to. The dealership was still reeling from Marcus Carter's visit long after he walked out. His words didn't just echo, they lingered, like smoke in the air, like weight on their shoulders. No one said it out loud, but every employee knew something had changed. Blake Thompson, who once strutted through the showroom with the arrogance of a man who believed he had the power to decide who was worthy, now walked with a different kind of silence. Not the comfortable kind, the heavy kind, the silence of a man stripped of certainty, unsure of what the next step would bring. But that step was coming, faster than he expected. The next day, Blake received a letter, hand-delivered, sealed in an envelope with Marcus Carter's Foundation logo pressed into the paper. Inside, the message was direct and cold. It wasn't filled with fury. There were no threats, just one simple demand. You will report to the Carter Foundation's Community Center tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. For 2 weeks you will serve under my direction. Consider this your opportunity to reflect, not through words, but through action." And beneath that was a final sentence, written in the smallest font. "Respect isn't something you wear, it's something you show." Blake read that line over and over again that night. He didn't sleep. Not much, anyway. At 7:58 the next morning, Blake stood outside the Carter Foundation's youth center, his arms crossed, his face tense. He looked out of place in his crisp button-down and expensive watch. This wasn't the marble-floored showroom or the polished glass world he was used to. This place was bright but modest, with laughter echoing faintly from somewhere inside. The building wasn't fancy, but it felt warm, human, alive, and Blake had never felt more disconnected. Linda Harris, the center's director, met him at the door with a smile that was genuine but professional. "Mr. Thompson, welcome. We've been expecting you." Blake nodded stiffly. "Let's get this over with," he muttered, not bothering to hide the bitterness in his voice. Linda's expression didn't falter. "You're not here for us," she replied gently. "You're here for yourself. You'll understand that eventually." She turned and walked inside, expecting him to follow. He hesitated. Then he did. The first thing that hit Blake was the energy. Children running around, their shoes squeaking on the tile floor, their laughter bouncing off the walls like music he didn't know the lyrics to. Some sat in small groups, working on homework or coloring. Others played board games or shot hoops in the small indoor gym. But what caught his attention most was how happy they were. Not rich, not polished, not perfect, but happy. It confused him. He didn't understand it yet. Linda handed him a simple schedule. "You'll assist with the younger group first. Thomas is one of our best helpers. He'll show you the ropes." And with that, a small boy appeared beside him, no taller than his waist, maybe 7 or 8 years old. Big eyes, wide smile, hair slightly messy. "Hi," the boy said cheerfully. "I'm Thomas. You can call me Mr. Blake if you want. That's what I used to call my old teacher, so now it's your turn." Blake blinked. He hadn't expected that. Just Blake is fine," he replied. Thomas grinned and nodded. "Okay, Blake it is. Come on, I'll show you where we keep the snacks." And just like that, Blake found himself following a kid half his size through a brightly lit hallway, past murals painted by children, past posters about kindness and resilience. He didn't realize it, but something inside him had already started to loosen, just a little. The hours crawled by. Blake sat awkwardly in a folding chair while children asked him for help with spelling and multiplication. He tried to keep his distance, but Thomas had other plans. "You're doing the word search with us," he said, pulling a chair next to his own and patting it. Blake sat down reluctantly, crossing his arms. "I'm not here to play games," he said. Thomas shrugged. "That's fine. I'll still win." As the day went on, something strange happened. Blake stopped checking his watch. He stopped rolling his eyes. He stopped needing to be anywhere else. He watched as kids with second-hand shoes and hand-me-down backpacks offered to share their snacks, gave each other encouragement, and called him Sir without sarcasm. He saw how they looked at the world, not with bitterness, but with hope. He saw Thomas quietly help a younger girl tie her shoes, saw another boy hand over his only pencil to a classmate who'd lost theirs. Small things. Things Blake had never paid attention to before, but now they stuck to him like raindrops on glass, slowly pooling into something deeper. At lunch, Thomas sat beside him again, munching on a peanut butter sandwich. "Do you like being here yet?" he asked, through a mouthful of food. Blake hesitated. "It's different." "Good different or bad different?" Thomas asked, wiping his hands on his jeans. Blake didn't answer. He didn't know how, not yet. But the real moment, the one that cracked something open, came later that afternoon. Blake saw Thomas alone near the window, carefully wrapping duct tape around the strap of a worn-out backpack that looked like it had been through 3 lifetimes. Blake walked over. "Why don't you get a new one?" he asked, genuinely curious. Thomas looked up, and his eyes were soft, not sad. "Because my mom gave me this one. Before she got sick, before she passed. I fix it because it's part of her. You don't throw things like that away." Blake didn't know what to say. The boy went back to taping, humming to himself. It was quiet, still, a kind of stillness Blake hadn't felt in years. That night, after he got home, he stared at the message screen on his phone for almost an hour. Then he typed, "Alexis, I was wrong about everything. I treated you with disrespect. I judged you by your appearance, and I'm so deeply sorry." He pressed send, sat back, and for the first time in a long time, he exhaled, not because the guilt was gone, but because he had finally started to feel it, and that was the beginning of everything. Blake returned to the Carter Foundation the next morning with a strange heaviness in his chest. It wasn't anxiety, it was something else, something more foreign to him than he cared to admit. Guilt, maybe. Or maybe it was the first hint of accountability. The previous day had peeled something back inside him, and all night he kept replaying that conversation with Thomas. The way that boy smiled through pain, the way he held onto a worn-out backpack like it was a treasure chest. It was humbling, and humbling wasn't a feeling Blake Thompson was used to. That day moved slower. Blake wasn't trying to rush through the hours anymore. He sat with the kids, listened more than he spoke, and helped without being asked. And though he was still stiff, still carrying the weight of pride he hadn't yet figured out how to shed, something was softening in him. By the end of the week, he wasn't just participating, he was engaging. He knew their names now. He knew who liked puzzles and who liked to draw, who was afraid of loud noises, and who needed a little extra encouragement to read out loud. But most of all, he kept gravitating toward Thomas. There was something magnetic about that boy, a lightness despite the hardships, a wisdom that didn't come from books. It came from surviving, from believing in something better. Blake noticed how Thomas always made room for others, how he never complained when he had less, how he laughed like nothing could touch him, even when it clearly had. One afternoon, as the sun filtered in through the classroom blinds, Blake watched Thomas teach a younger boy how to tie his shoelaces with so much patience and kindness that it made his throat tighten, and in that moment, something clicked. Thomas wasn't just a sweet kid. He was the kind of person Blake had spent years ignoring, overlooking, judging. And now, all he could do was sit there and wonder how many Thomases he'd walked past in his life, how many he had treated like they didn't belong. Back at Boston Luxury Motors, things were quieter too. Blake's absence hadn't gone unnoticed. Whispers floated around the showroom floor, but no one really knew the full story. Until one morning, the dealership phone rang with news that would flip the script entirely. Marcus Carter had returned, but this time he wasn't there to confront anyone. He was there to buy. The very car Alexis had come in to inquire about, the Lamborghini Aventador SVJ Roadster, was now being ordered. But Marcus made one thing clear from the start. The person handling the transaction would not be Blake. It wouldn't be Richard Mason, the owner, either. Marcus requested someone else, Daniel Miller, a junior sales associate who had stayed silent but kind during Alexis's visit. Daniel, the quiet one, the one who didn't smirk, the one who didn't judge. When Blake received the call from Richard, the news hit like a punch to the gut. Not just because he had lost the biggest sale of his life, but because it was Daniel, a guy he'd barely noticed, barely respected, who was now trusted with a client worth millions. That stung, not out of envy, but because deep down Blake knew Daniel had earned it, not with experience or seniority, but with character. Blake sat in the break room alone that afternoon, holding his phone, reading over the message he'd sent Alexis days ago. She hadn't responded. He hadn't expected her to. But something inside him still needed her to know he meant it. That this change wasn't about saving face. It was about facing what he'd become. At the dealership, Daniel greeted Marcus with calm professionalism, his voice steady, his hands slightly shaking from the pressure. But Marcus smiled, nodded, and said, I chose you because you were the only one who treated my daughter with the respect she deserved." Daniel blinked, stunned, unsure of how to respond. Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder. "Integrity," he said, "isn't about how you act when you're being watched. It's how you treat people when you think no one important is paying attention." That same evening, Blake returned to the Carter Foundation, but this time he didn't just sit with the kids. He asked Linda if he could stay longer, help with cleanup, organize the supplies, whatever was needed. When Thomas ran up to him, beaming and clutching a homemade drawing, Blake knelt down and accepted it like it was a priceless gift. "You're different now," Thomas said innocently, without any judgment, just observation. "You don't wear the mean face anymore." Blake laughed quietly. "I think your mom would be proud of you," he said. "I think she'd be proud of you too," Thomas replied, without skipping a beat. As the last day of Blake's volunteer work approached, he realized something profound. The Carter Foundation hadn't been a punishment, it had been a mirror, and what he saw in it was the version of himself he'd never wanted to admit existed. But now that he had seen it, he couldn't go back. He wouldn't. Weeks later, Boston Luxury Motors received an invitation to the Carter Foundation's annual charity gala, a night of celebration, community, and reflection. The dealership had never been invited before, and yet, this time, not only were they on the guest list, but Marcus Carter had made it clear he wanted Blake Thompson to be there. Blake stood in the corner of the ballroom, his tucks pressed, his expression more humble than it had ever been. The chandeliers sparkled overhead, but all he could focus on was the sight of Alexis entering the room. She wore a simple, elegant dress, no diamonds, no theatrics, just grace. Blake walked toward her slowly, heart pounding in his chest. When he reached her, he didn't stumble over his words. He didn't try to overcompensate. He just looked her in the eyes and said, "I'm sorry. Truly. Not because I lost a sale, not because I embarrassed myself, but because I saw you that day and chose not to." Alexis studied him for a moment. Then she nodded, her voice calm but firm. "I appreciate that, but change isn't something you prove with words. It's how you live, every day." Blake nodded, grateful just to be heard. "I'm trying," he said. "I really am." Alexis gave him the smallest smile. "Then keep trying." Later that night, Marcus took the stage to deliver a speech. The room quieted as his voice carried across the ballroom. He spoke of second chances, of integrity, of what it means to build a world where dignity isn't dictated by appearance. And then, to the surprise of many, he turned to the crowd and said, "Blake Thompson is here tonight, and while he once represented a failure of character, he now represents the possibility of growth. That's what this foundation is about, not revenge, but transformation." Blake stood there surrounded by applause, his chest tight with emotion. It wasn't pride, it was redemption, earned not by a single gesture, but by a journey, a long one, and it wasn't over. From that night on, everything changed. Blake became a different kind of leader at the dealership. He initiated mandatory bias training, introduced new hiring practices, and personally oversaw customer service standards. He returned to the Carter Foundation often, not out of obligation, but out of choice. He even bought Thomas a new backpack, but when he handed it to the boy, Thomas simply said, "I'll keep both. One reminds me of my mom, the other reminds me of you." Blake looked out at the city skyline from the dealership's rooftop one evening, the air crisp, the sky painted in soft gold. Below him, the showroom was bustling. But it didn't matter anymore who walked in wearing what. What mattered was how they were treated. And for the first time in his life, Blake Thompson knew what respect really meant. Not the kind you demand, but the kind you earn, one honest action at a time.